Well, today's sermon is based on these three readings, but it's about idolatry. And when we think about idolatry, mostly we think of this sort of thing, people bowing down to an idol somewhere and worshipping a statue. Or this is actually some footage that Sally and I shot in Japan last year. I was actually impressed by how much money they were throwing in, but that's the offertory box but in front of them. But that's what we think of when we think about idolatry. Or if we know our Bibles a bit, we might think about when the Israelites worshipped a golden calf. Or if we really think about idolatry, we might reflect on how we can end up worshipping more abstract things like money or sex or power or prosperity, or even our families. By the way, earlier this week, Sally asked me what the sermon was going to be about, and I said it was going to be about idolatry. And Sally said, there's a coal idol in Newcastle. And I didn't think there were any idols in Newcastle, but she said it was just down the road from Fort Scratchley. And so yesterday afternoon, I went and took some photos of it. And so here it is. It's quite a nice monument. And it does have a big block of coal on the top of it. And if you look at it from a certain angle, it actually does look as though it's lifting this block of coal up towards the heavens. But nobody was worshipping the monument, and so it didn't really look like an idol. But as I was there taking those photos, a ship blew its horn as it was steaming out of the harbour with another load of coal, and I realised that we might not worship this coal idol, but coal has certainly done a lot for the city of Newcastle. And that's one of the main things about an idol. Idolatry is all about what you get out of it. Idolatry is very pragmatic. Whatever works is fine. I'll give you a principle, an example of the principle behind idolatry. And most of you will know that I grew up in New Zealand, but I've lived in Australia for nearly 30 years, and so in that 30 years, I've learned that if you want the police or ambulance to turn up, you find a telephone and you dial 000. Now, in New Zealand, where I grew up, it's different. If you want the emergency services, you dial 111. Now, if we had an emergency here at church, I would get out my phone, and even though my phone has a picture of Jacinda Ardern on it, I would use it to dial 000. It's nothing to do with whether I think Scott Morrison is a better Prime Minister than Jacinda Ardern. I dial 000 in Australia because it works. And earlier in the service, we read about how the Israelites escaped from Egypt. And back in Egypt, if someone was going on a boat trip, they might pray for a safe journey to the god Sobek. Sobek was the god of the Nile. Or if they were a woman going on a trip, they might pray to the god Anuket, and she was the female god of the Nile. But no one would have criticised anybody else if they prayed to the wrong god, because there was no right or wrong. Whichever god worked was the right god for you, whatever floats your boat. And these days, if you're a Roman Catholic and you're driving into the city, you might ask St. Teresa to help you find a parking space, because she's the patron saint of parking spaces. But again, no one's going to worry if you have better luck finding a car spot when you pray to Saint Columbanus, who's the patron saint of motorcycles. And I did read an article on the internet about someone who thought that Mother Cabrini who's the patron saint of hospital administrators, She was a better person to find you a car spot because she used to live in New York. That makes sense, I think. Now, the thing that all three of these scenarios have in common is that it's all about what works best. In Australia, we dial 000 for emergency because it works. In Egypt, people prayed to whichever Nile River god gave them a safe trip. When we're deciding which saint to pray to, it's about what works. And that monument in East Newcastle is about what works. Coal has made an enormous contribution to the prosperity of this city. Coal is what works. And that is what idolatry is about. It's pragmatic. It's about what works. We choose a god and we stick with that god so long as it's useful, as long as we get what we want. If it doesn't work, then you try something else. And we actually see that happening in our reading from Exodus chapter 14. And here it is here. The Israelites said to Moses, "Was it because there was no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." What they're saying is that, all those plagues and stuff were really spectacular, and it's amazing the Egyptians actually let us go, but it's not working for us now. God, Moses, this God you've told us about, this God you've persuaded us to follow, is actually turning out to be pretty useless. We're going to die in the wilderness. Now, those Israelites had been slaves. And like most slaves, they had low expectations. And so if they were going to follow a god, they wanted a god that was useful. And as the Egyptian army closed in behind them, it looked very much as though they had made the wrong choice. But God had been upfront with them right from the very start. Back in Exodus chapter 3, God had spoken to Moses from the burning bush, and God said he was going to free the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. And when Moses had asked who God was, God had answered, "I am who I am." God wasn't saying anything about being the God who is useful or the God who works. God is the God who is. When you go for a job interview, one of the questions you'll get asked is, why do you think you can do this job? Or at least that's what I've been asked when I go for a job interview. Why do you think you can do this job? And Moses, as he was at the burning bush, Moses knew that it would be a big job to free the Israelites from slavery. He'd actually tried 40 years before, and it hadn't gone well. And freeing the slaves in America took a civil war, and 150 years later, it still isn't finished. So freeing people from slavery is a big job. And so that's what Moses wanted to know at the burning bush. Why do you think you can do this job? What are your credentials? Who are you? And we'd expect God to answer Moses and explain how it was all going to work, how God was able to do what was needed. We'd expect God to give Moses one of these names. These are all names of God from the Old Testament. Elohim, God strong and awesome, the judge of the world. Or Elyon, God most high. El Shaddai, God Almighty. El Roi, the God who sees. Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. But God doesn't use any of those names. God says, I am who I am. I am being what I am being. I will be what I will be. Egypt is going to suffer through 10 plagues. But God doesn't claim to be the God of plagues. The Israelites will escape from slavery in Egypt, but God doesn't claim to be the God of freedom or the true God of Egypt. The Israelites are going to cross the Red Sea on foot, as we read. But God doesn't claim to be the God of the Red Sea or the God of the wind. The Egyptian army will be destroyed. But God doesn't claim to be the God of war or the God of victory or even the Lord of hosts. And over 40 years in the desert, the Israelites will become the people of God. But at the burning bush, God doesn't claim to be the God of Israel. God doesn't even claim to be the God of the whole world. When Moses asks for God's credentials, God says, I am who I am. This is the God who is. The God who says, I am being what I am being, or I will be what I will be. This God that Moses talks to is not going to be defined by a description. God isn't a useful God. God is not about what works. If the Israelites are going to find out what this God is like, then they're going to have to follow and see what happens. Let me repeat that, it's very important. This God is not defined by a name or a description. If you want to find out what this God is like, then you'll have to follow and see what happens. And that's why the Israelites celebrate Passover every year. They look back to when God saved them in the past, and they look forward to what God will do in the future. And they're joining with other Jewish people all around the world, and together they're following God to see what happens. And in a few minutes, we're going to celebrate Holy Communion. We look back to when Jesus saved us in the past. And we look forward to when Jesus will return in the future. And again, we're joining with Christians all around the world, and we're following Jesus to see what happens. We're not having Holy Communion because it's useful or because it works. I mean, all you get is a bit of wafer. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that God is useless or that God doesn't work or that God just sits there saying, I am who I am. God did rescue the Israelites from slavery in Egypt and brought them across the Red Sea. God has acted in the past, and God will act in the future. And God is active in the present. God listened to the Israelites, and God saved them. God listens to us, and God saves us. But God isn't useful. God isn't something that works. Following God isn't something we can try out. We don't follow God to see how it works. It's not something we can do for a few weeks or months and then give it up because it isn't working. See, if you're after something that works, then Christianity probably isn't for you. Because if you're looking for something that works, you're actually looking for an idol. And there's plenty of idols around. You can take your pick. They all work, or at least they all claim to work. So there's money, sex, prosperity, power, families, coal, St. Teresa, Egyptian river gods, all the rest of it. There's lots of idols. But if we don't want an idol, then we need to trust the God who is. The God who says, I am who I am. The God who calls us to follow and to find out what the real God is like.